Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, well, we're jumping into something that isn't a beer. We've done a few, but it's not often. We're jumping into a hard cider today. The specific brewer of this one is called Greenwood Cider Company. They're based in Seattle, Washington. This specific cider is called Hops. It clocks in at 7.8% ABV, and it is a traditional dry cider that has indeed been brewed with 3 different hops: Citra, Centennial, and Crystal specifically. So this is a cider that is going to accentuate hops as a star of the show. So yeah, never had any ciders from Greenwood. This is one I got from Tavour. Obviously, Tavour based up, maybe not in Seattle proper, but definitely near that area. So they have, immediate access to a lot of different brewers and craft drink makers up in that area. So that's how I found about Greenwood. But yeah, sounds very interesting. I've had 1 or 2 kind of hopped ciders, but none that had it as kind of like the main theme. They just added some dry hopping for additional aromatics in the background. This, I'm expecting it to actually impart some bitters into the drink itself. So, label art on here, it's a very clean design. Just a white label. It's got this intricate kind of very pale lime green. The camera, I'm sure, will not pick that up, but trust me when I tell you it's a very cool looking but clean design. So, nice big bottle here. We're going to use our all-purpose Sam Adams glass today and just pour this right in. There is no chance it will hold this entire cider. Pouring it, it's a very clean, very lightly colored cider. This one is indeed very light. It's a very, very pale yellow, very pale yellow. Yeah, the camera may not even pick up the hint of yellow that it has in it. It's so clear and clean and pale. As with most ciders, it's very active in terms of carbonation, very effervescent. Ciders aren't renowned for making a head, so that really doesn't enter the equation in this rating and review. But we're going to get right up over this for a sniff. Oh, wow, yeah. That smells really nice. So it's got quite a pronounced aroma. You can 100% smell the underlying cider itself, but the hops also have a really dominant presence on the nose. So I'm expecting them taking Citra and Centennial and Crystal and adding it in here. That obviously clearly present in the aroma profile, but I'm expecting quite a bit of interplay in the flavor profile as well. Now, these hops obviously are known for various and subtle aromas as well. Given that Citra leans strongly on citrus, aromatics, hence the name, as well as flavor compounds, yeah, you would not be surprised to know that it does, in tandem with smelling like a base cider, there is a definite citrus note coming off into the nose as well. There's also a little bit of an herbaceous, piney note, which easily could be coming from the Centennial or the Crystal. Either way, it smells really, really nice. And what's kind of interesting for me on this one is, aside from the fact that they decided to make a blend of 3 different hops, kind of the star of this cider, they chose very high alpha acid content hops, Citra, Centennial, and Crystal. These are newer varieties that definitely have jacked up alpha acids. So there's a potential that it imparts a lot of bitters in this cider, especially being a dry cider. I'm not expecting a lactose addition. I'm expecting a complete fermentation. I don't believe this is going to be sweet, but we're about to jump in and find out. So take one. Oh yeah, very, very appley. It's not sweet. There is a suggestion of sweetness. So maybe it's not fully had all of the sugars consumed by the yeast, but it is not a sweet cider. Indeed, this is what they call a dry cider, which would be almost a traditional UK style of producing a cider. Quite a bit different than in America. We will often add lactose or just add less yeast than can possibly consume all of the sugars so that it retains a sweetness. So there are definitely different types of cider. This has a very apple-forward, prominent flavor. A slight suggestion of sweetness to still let the apple taste like the apple. Now, one thing I can tell you is in this, I am not getting a ton of bitters. So I am guessing that perhaps they used this hop blend mainly for aromatics, which are really, really nice on this one, and less leaning into a bitter and hop dominant flavor profile, which frankly would be atypical for a cider. But regardless, it's very, very nice. Now, this purporting to be a dry cider, it's one of the wetter dry ciders I've had to date. It's not ridiculously wet and sticky like many of the sweet, typical run-of-the-mill American ciders would be. Indeed, it definitely is more dry than that, but this is not on the level of, say, an English dry cider. This is significantly wetter, and there's a much more noticeable lack of a drying effect on the palate. Is it there? Yes, but it takes a while to get there, and it's rather subtle. It doesn't leave your mouth feeling like you just tried to eat a saltine cracker without a glass of water at hand. It's not like that. It's very subtle, it's very slight. It almost puts me in mind as how some Pilsners will have a drying effect on the end. Indeed, many Pilsners have a much more pronounced drying effect on the palate at the end than this cider does. But all of that notwithstanding, it is very, very delicious. So, in terms of body and mouthfeel, this is a 7.8% cider. It feels like a nice round medium heavy. It feels appropriate for what it is in the ABV range. In terms of the mouthfeel texturally, it's got resistance. You can feel that obviously it's an alcohol-laden beverage. It's denser, it's thicker, it moves around, but it doesn't get creamy, it doesn't get silky, it doesn't get foamy, which is typical for a cider. So weight and texture-wise, it's exactly what I expected. So as I would do with any beer as well, we're gonna jump back in for a second sip, let everything re-intensify, pick it apart again, make sure I didn't miss anything, then we'll talk about the balance and the finish. But on first sip, this is a very, very nice cider. So take two. Yeah, on second sip, when I'm really paying attention to the flavor profile, much more than anything, because I got weight and texture on the first round, it's up at the front where you do get the bitters. There are bitters in here, though it being Citra Centennial Crystal, if this were, say, a West Coast style IPA using the same hop bill, it's nowhere near that level of bitters. But if I had to put a number to IBU perception, I would guess 30, maybe 35. It's not super high, but it's enough that you actually, oh yeah, there's some bitters. So clearly, yes, they did do some hops in here, which we know that they did, but they definitely did it in part of the process to extract some of those alphas. Not a ton, but it's enough in there that, yeah, this is a cider that's got some big high alpha acid content hops. It does have bittering to it. And behind that is really where the subtle sweetness of the apple comes through. The distinct apple flavor is very, very nice. I don't know the exact apples they use in this, obviously, but it puts me in mind maybe of a cross between a Fuji and a Golden Delicious. It's got that kind of flavor profile. It's kind of a very juicy tasting apple with a pronounced apple bite, but there's no tartness to it like you would get in a Granny Smith. It's very, very nice. In terms of the balance of what they did with this, really look, for what it is, the balance is spot on. They hopped it and it's a cider. And the hops have great aromatic characteristics that are imparted in the cider. And they also have nice bittering and other underlying flavor elements that are imparted in the cider. So, I mean, really, that's all we're talking about. And a balance of something like this, I think they nailed it. It's nice. It still tastes like a cider, but the fact that they decided to use these hops, its presence is known. You get aroma and flavor profiles and bittering of the hops that were used. So spot on. In terms of the finish, like I said, this is a dry cider. It's not astringently dry, but there is a drying effect on the end. In terms of intensity of flavor, I would say this one is definitely more intense and lingering on the palate than your average cider would be. And it is not just the hops driving that factor. It's actually the intensity of the apple flavor. It's quite pungent. And this is 7.8% ABV. You know, in the realm of craft cider, that's maybe sitting somewhere on the high end of average, but compared to mass market cider, that's quite a bit higher ABV than you would find on those. So yeah, there is a bit more intensity of flavor here that does linger on the palate with a slight drying on the back. Overall, a very nice cider, guys. I'm going to take my time, sip on this one, count my scores. When we come back, we will get this ranked from top to bottom. All right, now that we've gotten to enjoy this cider, we're going to get it ranked. So this was Greenwood Cider Company's Hops, a hopped cider that clocked in at 7.8% ABV. Greenwood Cider Company is based in Seattle, and this specific cider had added citra, centennial, and crystal hops into the mix. So very, very interesting. We don't do a ton of ciders here on the channel, but when I saw on Tavour this pop up, and then it had 3 really nice high alpha acid content hops added into the cider and a dry cider at that, I said, okay, I got to try this. Definitely the first cider I've ever had by Greenwood Cider Company. So we're going to jump right in and go through the scores. Starting with the aroma on this was really, really nice. You could smell the underlying cider itself, and you could smell the underlying hops as well, but I did expect to pick up maybe just a little bit more of intensity from the hop addition subtleties. It was clear that they did some dry hopping with this cider. At least that's what it tasted like to my palate, both on the flavor profile and indeed smelled like on the aroma side to my nose. There was quite a bit that popped out, but I would have wished for just a little bit more intensity. It smelled fine, and it was definitely above average, but I was just craving a little bit more since they called it hops after all. But I did give it an 8 out of 10. For the taste, overall, I really, really enjoyed the flavor of this cider. It wasn't astringently sweet. It's a traditional dry cider regardless anyway, so you don't want a ton of that sweetness in there, but it did distinctly taste of apple. And yes, I did get some hop characteristics in there, but with these high alpha acid content hops, I was really hoping for just a little bit more presence in the flavor profile and maybe a little bit more presence from the bittering. I'm not suggesting that just because they use 3 high alpha acid content hops that they should have made an IPA version of a cider here, but personally, I was just hoping for just a little bit more presence since they took the time to add in these 3 hops and then called it hops. But again, overall, I thought it was above average. The taste, I also gave an 8 out of 10. For the body, this was textbook for a cider and for the ABV range. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the mouthfeel, same story as the body. It had the right amount of resistance. Didn't get foamy, creamy, or anything like that. That is very atypical for a cider regardless. The mouthfeel also gets a 10 out of 10. For the finish on this was quite nice. Indeed, it was longer than your average cider, and it really did come down to the hops, even though they weren't as bold and pungent and forward, especially in the bitter forward side of the department here that you might anticipate. Given the hops that they chose, it did have a nice long finish. Now, one thing I would have liked was just a little bit more of a drying aspect, but in general, had a nice length and it was still there. You just had to wait for it. And that didn't get a knock from me. The finish, I did give a 10 out of 10. For the head and retention, guys, it's a cider. It's not really relevant in this category. It didn't form one. I give it a perfect score. There's no point knocking points off a cider for that. So head and retention does get a perfect 10 out of 10. For the appearance, this was a very, very lovely cider. It was clearly a lighter apple. They didn't use a lot of skin in there. So, you know, it was just kind of the natural color of the juice. Plus the hops that were added in there was absolutely lovely. Just a bright, clear, pale, pale, pale yellow. The appearance does get a perfect 10 out of 10. For the balance, in general, I thought the balance was quite nice. In a cider like this, really we're talking about a balance between the apple composite side plus the hops that they added. I did like it, and in general there was pretty nice harmony there, but I would have liked just a bit more presence from the hops. The apple was a heck of a lot more clear, which to be fair, it is a cider, so credit where credit's due, but they had 3 big high alpha acid modern hops in there. I would have liked just a bit more presence. The balance, though, still above average. I gave an 8 out of 10. Feeling of the intangible. Subjectively, I enjoyed this, but I was personally craving a bit more dryness, a bit more hop aroma, a bit more bitters on the front side, and I would have liked just a little bit more presence from the hops all around. But this is my subjective category, and I still thought it was above average, so feeling an intangible, I gave a 7 out of 10. Finally is an example of the style. So it's not every day that you see a hopped variant of a cider. That's indeed quite the rare treat, and I thought it was very, very nice. So really for the style, there's only a few I've ever had like this, and this one did a very good job. Just lost a few points in a few categories, but in the grand scheme, well above average. Example of the style, I did give a 9 out of 10, which brings the total score on Greenwood Cider Company's hops to a 90 out of 100. So definitely well above average, guys. So yeah, this was a very interesting and unique cider. You don't get a ton like this. I don't review a ton of ciders, but I'm glad that I got my hands on this one. I did get it from Tavour. Don't know if you can still get it there. Maybe check your local shops if you're interested, Craft Shack, someplace like that. But this was very, very nice. Very well done. My own personal preferences aside, extremely, extremely good example of a base cider. Even without the hops, it would have been a very, very nice dry cider. With the hops, it just made it that much more enjoyable. Folks, that is today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live, just turn on your notifications. Hit that bell icon. It is right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.